Hey y'all, Brown's back at it again. This time we're going to be learning about the pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis. Now, your pituitary gland, interestingly enough, is not a single homogeneous gland. It's actually more like two glands. The anterior pituitary is largely made of epithelial tissue, and it develops from the primitive roof of the mouth, whereas the posterior pituitary is nervous tissue, and it develops from the primitive base of the brain, what will become the diencephalon of the brain. So if we look at the area right smack in the middle, we see something that looks like this. So the tissue, I don't think red is a good color here, so let's switch this up to, how about bright yellow? If we draw a line on here, sometimes my pen takes a second to catch up. There we go. Everything to the right of the line I'm drawing is anterior pituitary. And then everything to the left is posterior pituitary. And you can see that they look quite different. In the next slide, we're going to look at how the pituitary develops, and then we're going to explore the different regions beyond just anterior and posterior. And then after that, we'll go through and look at those regions' actual histology and see how they impart function to those different regions of these two different kinds of glands. The pituitary develops between the floor of the diencephalon and the roof of the stomadeum, which is the primitive gut tube, what will become the mouth. And you can see that the diencephalon is going to grow downward, whereas the stomadeum, the roof of the mouth, is going to form this pouch called the hypophyseal recess, or Rathke's pouch. As the roof of the mouth kind of gets further from the floor of the brain, you're left behind with this little bit of endodermal tissue, which will then migrate around the stalk or infundibulum from which the posterior pituitary hangs. So, what we're left with is something like, let's pick a more pleasant color for this. How about this kind of orange color? If we're looking at this being the diencephalon of the brain, here, we'll come across here, then the posterior pituitary is kind of dangling from the diencephalon like so. So this is the posterior pituitary here, and this little guy right there is called the infundibulum. Now the anterior pituitary, which we'll put in here in, say, blue, remember, after it separates from the roof of the mouth, it kind of grows up and around this infundibulum. So it's going to do something like this. It's going to come across, like so, around here. And then, of course, we still have that remnants of that hypophyseal pouch, that Rathke's pouch there. So this is the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary can be divided into three parts. The part that wraps around the infundibulum of the posterior pituitary is called the pars tuberalis, P-A-R-S, tuberalis. The main part of the pituitary, the one that does most of the secretion, is called the pars distalis. And then this little bit right here, this kind of, it ends up being rather poorly differentiated, is called the pars, ooh, that was bad. Let's fix that real quick. And I erased my R up top. Having pen problems today, gang. There we go. So the pars intermedia. Now, the nervous tissue of the posterior pituitary is sometimes then also referred to as the pars nervosa. Cool. What we're going to do now is go through and actually look at the histology of these three regions of the anterior pituitary, talk about the cells you can find in them, what those cells produce, and then we'll wrap up by looking at the posterior pituitary. The pars distalis is the main body of the anterior pituitary gland, and it contains three cell types. The first, I'll outline this one kind of, is blue good? I think blue will work. There's one down here. I feel like there was one right up in here. These little guys are called chromophobes. And chromophobe, there we go. They get this name because they don't really take up either the red acidic or blue basic dye very well, so they're chromophobic. They fear colors. The dark, intensely red staining cells are called acidophils, and the purple or bluish, these are mostly purple, those are basophils. Don't get these confused with basophilic leukocytes. So these are pituitary basophils, not the antibody, or not the inflammatory mediating basophils of the bloodstream. Now, the acidophils and the basophils can further be broken down based on the specific hormone that they produce. And if we look at this picture, we can see different sections of anterior pituitary that have been stained using immunohistochemistry, so that we're going to use a primary antibody that recognizes that hormone, so prolactin or growth hormone or luteinizing hormone or whatever, and then we're going to use a secondary antibody with an enzyme called horseradish peroxidase, which will stain the cells brown when exposed to its substrate. Now, prolactin is going to be made by cells called lactotrophs. So called because they make prolactin, PRL, that is the hormone that tells the mammary glands to produce milk. Growth hormone, to the right of the prolactin, are the cells stained that produce growth hormone. This is made by cells called somatotrophs. And you might be asking yourself, hey Brown, why don't you call it growth hormonotrophs or something? Well, the other name for growth hormone is somatostatin. We typically call it growth hormone now, but it used to be called primarily somatostatin, so these are called somatotrophs. Both of these are going to be acidophils. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, is made by corticotrophs. And this hormone targets the adrenal cortex, so corticotrophs because it goes to the adrenal cortex. Thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, is made by thyrotrophs. And then finally, luteinizing hormone over here, the LH, is considered a gonadotropic hormone. It targets the gonads and tells them to produce sex hormones. The cells called gonadotrophs produce gonadotropin hormones. I think I mispronounced it earlier twice. The hormones are called gonadotropins. The cells that make them are gonadotrophs. And these guys are going to make luteinizing hormone, which in men is called interstitial cell stimulating hormone. And these are also going to make follicle stimulating hormone. All of these are basophilic anterior pituitary cells. Okay, so we got 5 different kinds of cells making 6 different hormones in the pars distalis. If we look in the pars tuberalis, we're going to see a patch of secretory cells here. I really love this picture because you can also see the blood vessels of the pituitary portal system in here. I just think that's really rad. So these cells are primarily gonadotrophs. They're going to make gonadotropin hormones. The other cool thing about this picture, in addition to seeing this patch of gonadotropin releasing cells, is that this dashed line is the border between the pars tuberalis here and the infundibulum down here. You can see very different structure down here in the infundibulum versus in the pars tuberalis. Finally, as far as the anterior pituitary goes, we get the pars intermedia. The pars intermedia kind of sticks out into the posterior pituitary a little bit, so you can see kind of right in here. There we go. This is what's left of Rathke's pouch, and it's primarily filled with colloid. And the pars intermedia over here contains mostly poorly differentiated cells, some corticotrophs, primarily active during the fetal stage of life. So in you guys, probably not a lot going on here in the pars intermedia. That's it for the anterior pituitary. Now let's go look at the posterior pituitary. All this tissue out in here, and you're going to see it looks very, very, very different. I'm going to go ahead and switch to a yellow pen. And here we go. What do you guys do with secretory cells? I don't see none. Nobody sees any. There aren't any secretory cells to be seen in the posterior pituitary. Instead, what you're looking at is primarily axons. The cells that produce the posterior pituitary hormones, which are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, I'll just write those over here, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, those cells are actually up in the hypothalamus, right up in here. These are neurosecretory cells. They're neurons. So the soma of these secretory neurons lives up in the hypothalamus, and when we need to release oxytocin or antidiuretic hormone, the hormone is made in the pericardium, the soma up in here. It travels down the axons via anterograde axonal transport, where it's going to accumulate as little secretory vesicles called herring bodies down here in the posterior pituitary. What you're looking at over here on the left, this is mostly axon. These are axons. Most of the nuclei you see in here are glial cell nuclei, Schwann cell nuclei. I don't know if they're Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes, to tell you the truth, out here in the pituitary gland. What I do know is that the posterior pituitary contains two things in great abundance: axons and capillaries. So if you look in here, you can see several different capillaries. Here's one in transverse section. It's a little bit of capillary over here. You can see there's capillary everywhere. So the hormones are released from the axons via exocytosis. They make their way into the capillaries, and then off they go to wherever in your body they need to go to do their job. In the case of oxytocin, it can be to the mammary glands, or it can be to parts of the brain. In the case of antidiuretic hormone, it's to your kidneys to tell you to make less urine. That's pretty much it for the pituitary gland. I hope you enjoy this and have fun. Study hard, and we'll see you later.